without further ado, we're going to get started with our first speaker. Let me tell you just a couple of things about Brian, who is a neonatal research fellow at the Mater Women's Hospital in Brisbane. He has a great interest in education, preterm babies, and small brains. You can also find him on Twitter at Dr. Brian J. Dunn. So if he says something controversial, do tag him in your tweets and we'll start a nice discussion. Thank you, Brian.
It's 3 a.m. in Melbourne. It's one of those hot summer nights where the sun's gone down, but the thermometer's barely noticed. Sarah's in bed with her pregnant partner, Artie, and they're tossing and turning, sheet on, sheet off, sheet on, sheet off. It's about 3 a.m. and she turns over to Artie, touches her back, and Artie's hot, even for a night like this. Artie starts talking to her. She's not making a lot of sense. Says something about waking up, thinking maybe she'd wet herself. She's not sure. Actually, she thinks her waters have gone. Sarah has been ready for this since the moment they knew they were pregnant. Her bag is packed, ready to go. She rushes them down to the car. The car is fully charged. Since their first scan, that battery has not been less than 50%. As they walk out the door, they can taste the acrid scent, that smell, the taste of the bushfires. Yeah. As they drive into the hospital, you can barely see the stars that normally you might be able to see in the city because the smoke is still blotting out the sky. When they arrive in the ED, they're seen very quickly. You see, Artie is 21 and a half weeks pregnant. Sarah's not quite sure what that means. She knows when she tells this story down the track that the next few hours seem like a bit of a blur. She remembers people coming in, introducing themselves. She remembers the obstetrician. She remembers the neonatologist. She thinks there was someone called a perfusionist. When their baby is born, she barely has time to notice that she's had a daughter. Her daughter is rushed to the corner of the room where the neonatologist is placing her in some sort of bag. The perfusionist is doing something to the cord. The doctors call their baby a set and forget. The next few weeks go by relatively smoothly. Apparently she needed some antibiotics in her circuit, but after that, she did very well. Sarah tells her friends that sometime after 30 weeks, the doctors gave her something about activating surfactant, and their baby was moved from the poddery to the special care nursery. Their daughter goes home. Ooh, how do I make it go? That story might sound like science fiction, but it's coming. It'll probably happen in our lifetimes. Many of you might be aware that around the world, people are looking at how we can support fetuses ex utero. The most successful of the devices under development is this, the Extend device. Now you might think, is this some crazy idea being peddled by a mad scientist? This research group is based at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The plan is that it will enter clinical trials for babies born between 23 and 25 weeks in the very near future. Doesn't help you though, does it? Because in the next few weeks, you'll go back to the hospitals you work in, and you'll be faced with the very real problem of babies born between 22 and 25 weeks. Babies we call babies of the grey area. The thing that I would say about grey areas is that we actually know quite a lot about them. For example, we know more about the topography of the moon than we do about the depths of our oceans. We know that not all babies born at this gestational age are alike. We know that there are differences based on sex, based on genetics, based on why you've been born preterm. What we need to do is stop talking about the term viability like any of us in this room believe in biological determinism. If you did, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be doing the jobs that you do. What is viability? A term I've been very careful not to mention until I'm 4 minutes in. It's what we say it is. In reality, it's what is technically feasible. It's what is morally feasible. It's somewhere between 22 and 25 weeks currently. But is it? This paper, published in 2018, compares physician attitudes at 3 comparable centres. 3 rich Western economic countries, similar cultures, similar religions, and yet what you see is a marked difference. You see, what they were asked is, how comfortable would you be not resuscitating a baby at this gestation? In the Netherlands, where it's routine to never resuscitate a baby before 26 weeks, all the physicians answered and said, I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable waiting. Some of us in this room would feel uncomfortable. In Sweden, where the situation is very different, physicians felt a little bit uncomfortable at 22 weeks, quite uncomfortable at 23 weeks, and really very uncomfortable by the time babies reached 24 weeks. And the UK, as always, lay somewhere in between. Why does it matter? Well, currently we operate under the remit of an ethical tool called zone of parental discretion. It's a good tool. It's one I advocate for. But is it a perfect tool? No. Why? Because just to be devil's advocate, when we tell parents about the potential for negative outcomes, can you imagine a similar situation? An ambulance arrives at the roadside of an RTA. The paramedic says, oh, we could take your kid to hospital, but this could happen. It's unthinkable. The reason it's important we think about using that tool is this paper, again published in 2018. What it compares is survival rates for babies born at 22 weeks in 2 different centres, comparable centres, one in Uppsala in Sweden, one in the United States. Similar populations, similar number of deliveries, same access to resources. They take 2 different approaches. Some of you may be aware that the Swedish are very proactive in resuscitating these extreme preterm babies. The Americans, less so. They use zone of parental discretion. Parents are counselled about the risk of mortality and morbidity. There's a very real danger there that we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what happens is when the rare parent at the US centre elects for resuscitation at that gestational age, their outcomes are not comparable to the centre that does proactive resuscitation of these newborns routinely. Some of you may have heard of Stead Children's Hospital in Iowa in the US. They report outcomes that are frankly difficult to believe. This is some recent data published in 2021 that looks at babies born at 22 and 23 weeks resuscitation. I want you to think about the last time you thought about counselling a parent potentially facing a delivery at that gestation and the figures that you gave them. These guys say that they're seeing figures where 2/3 of their babies go home without neurodevelopmental impairment or with only mild neurodevelopmental impairment. I'm not the first person to be interested in centres like this. They exist. Japan, Sweden, Iowa. You've got to wonder what they're doing differently. Many of my colleagues have been to visit these centres, and they come back and they're excited. And what do they want to talk about? They want to talk about the mode of ventilation that they use. Did they use high frequency? Did they use jet? They want to talk about how tightly they manage the glucose. They want to talk about the fluid management. They want to talk about all of these many and various things. But do you know what they all say to a person? They say, the thing is, Brian, they didn't seem that different to us. What I wonder about is whether these centres are benefiting from something in particular. I don't know if there are many Brits in the audience. We seem to be overly represented today. Some of you may know a guy called Dave Brailsford. Let me tell you about him. He's a bit of a British hero. Dave Brailsford, in the mid-noughties, was given the unenviable task of running British cycling. Just to put things in context, at that time, British cycling was nothing short of atrocious. He had no superstars that he was aware of coming through the pipeline, and he had very few options with an Olympics knocking on the door. What did he do? He believed in a program that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. What did he mean by that? Well, he thought that his athletes would turn up and train better if they'd had a good night's sleep. So he made sure that everyone had a good mattress. He thought that they'd probably train more if they weren't sick so often, so he made sure that hand washing was religious. Tiny changes. People thought he was ridiculous. In 2012, Bradley Wiggins was the first British man to win the Tour de France. And at 2012, the Great British Cycling Team took home 70% of the cycling medals on offer. Are these centres, through frequency of resuscitation, because these babies are not common, experiencing aggregation of marginal gains? It matters most of all that whatever we choose to do about this difficult population, we're all on the same page. Why does that matter? Because sometimes things can get very messy indeed. This is some data from a recent study. Some of you might be aware that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, they say that it's not unreasonable to resuscitate babies at 22 weeks. Thank you. But they also don't recommend giving women steroids before 23 weeks, despite the fact that we know if you give a 22-week of steroids, they're more than half as likely to go home than if they haven't been exposed to them at all. What I'd like to persuade you is that the decision to actively manage babies at these extremes of prematurity is not an irrevocable one. But we're not talking about numbers or statistics, percentages. We're talking about people. What we're talking about is giving people a chance. You can change the direction of your care at any point. It's important that if you think there's even a slight chance these babies go to tertiary centres, that mum gets consideration of steroid loading. But it's important at any point that if things are too much for this baby, you can reprioritise their care. We know that if a baby born at 23 weeks survives to 7 days of life, their odds of going home have gone from the region of 30 to 40% all the way to 95+%. This is important because it avoids something that I find difficult to say. It avoids let-die mistakes. Some of you might be familiar with the ethicist Dominic Wilkinson, originally from these parts actually. These days he works in Oxford. He talks about let-die mistakes. Let me tell you about let-die mistakes. When I was a trainee, very early in my training, when I was back in the UK, I was asked to attend the delivery of a 23-week baby. I was an SHO. They didn't send me, don't get the wrong impression, because I was some sort of gun at neonatal resuscitation. They sent me because they were expecting that we would do nothing at all. My job in that room was to assess the baby when they were born, see how vigorous they were, make a decision about whether I should call the team, try to intubate them, resuscitate them. The baby was born. She didn't do much. I made my apologies and I left. And I wonder now, 10 years later, what would have happened if that family had come to my current centre and seen me. What I didn't know then, as an SHO, was about the body of evidence that was accumulating, including a paper written by a man on this stage, demonstrating that physicians are rubbish at knowing from the first few minutes of life how a baby will do in the long term. It can't be done. It's not a fair test. I'm worried about more let-die mistakes. One thing I would say is that in neonates, we love a compound outcome: death and BPD, death and neurodisability. The easiest thing in the world for me, and something I considered when giving this talk, would be to come on this stage and tell you about what we think of as classical success stories, about the 22, 23-weekers, the 300, 400-gram babies who go home and have what we think of as normal, healthy lives. Brilliant. We should celebrate them. But we should also celebrate the children who face difficulties, who have developmental impairments, and we have to be very careful about the language that we use when we talk to the public, when we counsel parents, about where we stand with regard to developmental impairment, particularly because we know in our current NICU graduates who face developmental impairment, they report better quality of lives than age-matched peers in their teenagers. In fact, the single most useful predictor of how you will experience your life as a teenager is your parental attitude at the time you're born. We have to be very careful about not buying into ableist language. And I don't mean, in any sense, to lessen the challenges that people with disability and their families face. But I do mean to make us think. I'd like to close with a story. In 1920, Lucille Horn was born in a hospital in New York City. She weighed 2 pounds. For those of you who haven't had the benefit of an imperial education, that's about 900 grams. The doctors comforted her parents. They were kind. They said they were sorry. There was nothing they could do. Lucille would die. Lucille's father wasn't comfortable with that. He asked for warm blankets. He bundled his daughter up, wrapped her up tightly, and he hailed a cab and took his 2-pound daughter to an amusement park in Coney Island, where a man called Martin Cooney, who probably wasn't even a doctor, was running an incubator show. It was the only way you could run that many incubators. Cooney took Lucille in. I'm sure that when his father left that hospital, people thought, he's a bit crazy, probably won't work, futile, hopeless. What kind of mess is he making for Lucille's future? They probably had the same kind of skepticism that we all just felt when we thought about using the Extend device. If you want to know what Lucille Horn was like, you can Google her. You can find an interview with her. She died 6 years ago. She was 97. In those interviews, the thing that will strike you the most is how grateful she is that she was given a chance. Wouldn't it be good if 100 years from now, there were more interviews saying the same thing?